What if one of history's most terrifying monsters was never a monster at all, but a victim whose story was stolen from her? Tonight, we're journeying back to ancient Greece, to a world of shimmering temples under the watchful eyes of Olympus. As you settle in, please feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy our journeys into the past. I always love to see how far our stories travel. So I'd be delighted if you'd share where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's a wonderful way for us to feel connected. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we travel beyond the myth to uncover the lost story of Medusa, beginning not with a monster, but with a young woman whose devotion would seal her fate. The sun in Athens rose with a gentle insistence, casting a soft, golden light across the city. High above the awakening streets, on the sacred hill of the Acropolis, the great Parthenon seemed to capture the very first rays of dawn. Its marble columns, which would later gleam a brilliant white in the midday heat, now glowed with a warm, rosy hue. Inside this sanctuary, a profound stillness reigned, broken only by the soft, rhythmic sweeping of a broom and the whisper of bare feet on stone. This was the world of Medusa. Her day began long before the first merchants opened their stalls in the agora below. It began in the cool, hallowed quiet of the temple of Athena. Medusa was an acolyte, a priestess of the maiden goddess. This was not a simple duty. It was the highest honor a young Athenian woman could hope to achieve. To be chosen to serve Athena Polius, the divine protector of the city, was to be set apart. It was to live a life of piety, purpose, and public reverence. Medusa carried this honor not as a burden, but as the core of her identity. Her very name, in the tongue of the Greeks, meant guardian, protectress, and here, in this magnificent house of the gods, she was its guardian. She felt the truth of her name in the marrow of her bones, in the steady beat of her mortal heart. Each morning, she would rise from her simple cot in the chambers reserved for the priestesses. She would wash in cool water and dan her sacred garments. The cloth was always a simple, elegant white, a woven symbol of the purity required to serve a goddess who was eternally a maiden. As she fastened the robe, she would take a moment to look at her reflection in a polished bronze mirror. She saw a face of remarkable beauty, with features that poets might struggle to describe. But Medusa gave little thought to her own appearance. Her focus was on the purity of her soul, on her unwavering devotion to Athena. She had taken a vow of chastity, a sacred promise to remain untouched, dedicated solely to her divine patron. It was a vow she cherished, for it bound her closer to the goddess of wisdom. Her first duty was to the sacred flame, housed in a golden lamp. This fire was never allowed to die. It was a symbol of Athena's eternal presence, the city's enduring spirit. Medusa would carefully trim the wick and refill the lamp with the finest olive oil, a gift from the sacred groves that Athena herself had given to the city. The scent of the burning oil, clean and earthy, was the first fragrance of her day. It mingled with the lingering aroma of frankincense and myrrh from the previous evening's offerings, creating an atmosphere that was uniquely serene. It was the scent of holiness. With the flame tended, she would move through the vast, high-ceilinged sanctuary. Her bare feet knew the texture of every stone, the cool smoothness of the ancient marble worn down by generations of faithful attendants. She would feel the profound silence of the space, a silence that seemed to hold all the prayers ever uttered within its walls. Sunlight began to filter through the high columns of the temple, which was a marvel of the new Doric style, only recently completed in the year 438 before the Common Era. These beams of light created shifting patterns on the floor, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air like tiny celestial spirits. The play of light and shadow was a constant, silent sermon on the nature of gods and mortals. In the heart of the temple stood the cult statue of Athena, a colossal figure of ivory and gold. Part of Medusa's duty was to ensure its cleanliness, to wipe away any trace of dust from the gleaming surfaces. She would look up at the serene, powerful face of the goddess and feel a sense of overwhelming awe. Here was wisdom, strength, and divine order made manifest. This was the center of her universe. At the foot of the statue, citizens would leave their offerings. There were small terracotta figurines, humble prayers given form. There were bolts of finely woven cloth, especially the peplus, a beautiful robe painstakingly crafted by the women of Athens. And always there were jars of precious olive oil. Medusa would arrange these offerings, her movements a quiet prayer in themselves. The weight of her responsibility was immense, but she felt it most keenly in the object she carried at her waist, a set of heavy bronze keys. These were the keys to the temple, to its treasury, to its most sacred inner chambers. Their weight was a constant, physical reminder of the trust placed in her. To harm a priestess was a grave sacrilege, a crime against the gods themselves, and the people of Athens showed her nothing but respect. Yet there was another weight she carried, a deeper, more private one. Medusa was one of 3 sisters, the Gorgons, but a strange fate had set her apart. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, were immortal. They were ancient beings, born of primordial sea deities. Medusa, alone among them, was born immortal. Her life was a fleeting, fragile thing in a world of eternal gods and ageless siblings. This knowledge did not fill her with sadness, but with a sense of urgency, a desire to make her short life a perfect offering to the divine. She was a guardian, yes, but she was a mortal guardian, watching over an eternal flame. From the sacred confines of the temple, we broaden our view to the bustling city that it oversees, a city as vibrant and full of life as Medusa's faith. The Acropolis was the symbolic heart of Athenian power and culture, but the city's true pulse beat in the streets and public squares below. When her duties allowed, Medusa would descend from the high hill, following the grand Panathenaic way as it sloped gently down into the heart of Athens. The transition was always a powerful one, from the hushed reverence of the sanctuary to the chaotic, energetic symphony of human life. The Panathenaic Way was the main artery of the city, a wide road that cut through Athens from the Dippolon Gate to the Acropolis itself. It was along this very road that the great Panathenaia festival took place every 4 years, a magnificent procession that culminated in the presentation of a new, beautifully woven peplus to the statue of Athena that Medusa so carefully tended. Walking this path, she felt connected to every citizen, to the very history of this revolutionary place. Athens in this era, the age of Pericles, was a city at the zenith of its power and splendor. It was a city brimming with ideas, with art, with the bold experiment of democracy. As Medusa walked, the sounds of the city grew louder. They were a cacophony of life itself. There was the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the rumble of wooden cartwheels over stone, the distant sound of actors rehearsing their lines in the great theater of Dionysus, nestled on the slope of the Acropolis. and underneath it all was the constant hum of human voices. People spoke in a dozen different dialects and languages, for Athens was a magnet, drawing traders and thinkers from across the known world. She would pass artisans in their workshops, their hands skillfully shaping clay on a potter's wheel, decorating vases with intricate scenes of gods and heroes. She saw sculptors working on new monuments, their chisels tapping away at blocks of marble, releasing figures from their stone prisons. The air itself was thick with a tapestry of smells. There was the warm, comforting scent of baking bread from a nearby bakery, mingling with the savory aroma of roasting meats from a cookshop. Carried on the breeze from the port of Piraeus, connected to the city by the formidable long walls, was the faint, salty temps of the sea. It was a reminder of the source of Athens's wealth and naval power, a constant presence on the edge of their lives. Medusa might pause to buy fresh figs from a farmer's stall, their sweetness a burst of sunshine on her tongue. She might purchase a small piece of salty cheese, a staple of the Greek diet, to be eaten with bread and a little watered-down wine. Her destination was often the agora. This was the central public space of Athens, a sprawling, open area that was the city's commercial, political, and social hub. It was here that the concept of self-governance, a radical idea that would shape the future of the world, was put into daily practice. Men who were citizens would gather to debate laws, to vote, and to shape the destiny of their city-state. Medusa, as a woman, could not participate, but she could observe the fervor, the passion with which the Athenians conducted their public life. The currency that exchanged hands was the silver drachma, each coin stamped with the image of an owl, the sacred bird of her goddess, a constant reminder of the wisdom that was meant to guide these transactions. The agora was a chaotic, beautiful mess of humanity. Merchants shouted, hawking their wares that ranged from fine pottery to exotic spices. Politicians stood on platforms, trying to win over the crowds with their powerful rhetoric. And in the shaded colonnades, another kind of discussion was taking place. Philosophers, men like the great Socrates, would gather with young students, not in a formal school, but right there in the open. They debated the nature of truth, of justice, of the ideal state. Their questions and arguments were as much a part of the agora's atmosphere as the haggling of the vendors. As a revered priestess, Medusa moved through this space with a special grace. People would make way for her, bowing their heads in respect. She was a living symbol of the city's divine protection. But as she walked among them, she felt not separate, but deeply connected. She saw the vibrant, messy, brilliant world that Athena guarded. She saw the people whose prayers she carried into the temple. One of the most striking things to a modern eye would be the color. The statues and temples were not the stark white marble we see today. They were painted in vibrant reds, blues, and golds, making the city a dazzling spectacle under the hot Attic sun. It was a world of intense sensation, a place that felt fully and completely alive. This was the world Medusa knew. This was the world she loved. While Medusa was deeply connected to Athens, her familial roots were far older and stranger. They reached back into the primordial depths of the sea, into an age before the reign of the Olympian gods. Her quiet, pious life in the sunlit city stood in stark contrast to the nature of her family. When the duties of the day were done, and she was alone in the quiet of her chambers, her thoughts would sometimes drift to her sisters, Steno and Euryale. This was a sisterhood of stone and sea, a bond that defied easy explanation. Her sisters were Gorgons, And unlike Medusa, they had been born immortal. They were the daughters of ancient sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto, whose children were often monstrous beings from the shadowy corners of myth. Creatures like the sea witch, Scylla, and the Gree, the three old women who shared a single eye and tooth. This lineage placed Medusa in a very strange position. She was related to some of the most feared monsters of the deep, yet she lived a life dedicated to the Olympian goddess of wisdom and civilization. Her bloodline tied her to the fundamental, chaotic elements of the world, to Gaia, the earth, and Pontus, the sea. Stheno and Euryale were primordial forces. Their very names spoke of their nature. Stheno meant the mighty, or the forceful one, a name that evoked raw, untamable strength. Euryale meant the farspringer, a name that suggested the vast, leaping expanse of the open ocean. They were not evil, not in the human sense. They were simply other. They existed at the very edge of the known world, in a remote, mythical land near the realm of eternal night, a place few mortals had ever seen. They were nature in its wildest form, untamed and unchanging. In early Greek art, the Gorgons were depicted as truly monstrous. They had gaping mouths with lolling tongues and the tusks of a boar. Sometimes they were shown with beards, bronze claws, and even wings of gold. They were terrifying figures, designed to ward off evil. Her sisters had been born this way. Their monstrous forms were their natural state. But Medusa was different. She had been born entirely human, entirely mortal, and by some strange twist of fate, breathtakingly beautiful. This difference was the great paradox of her life. When she was with her sisters, a rare and secret occasion, the contrast was profound. She, in her simple white priestess robes, felt exquisitely fragile next to their raw, ancient power. Their voices were deeper, more resonant than any human's, like the sound of waves breaking against a rocky shore. Their presence was overwhelming, a force of nature contained in a physical form. Yet, beneath their fearsome exteriors, there was a deep and protective love for their mortal sister. They were her family. Medusa had a quiet, shared memory she often returned to. It was of the three of them, sitting together on a remote, rocky shore, looking up at the countless stars. She remembered the feeling of being profoundly, achingly human. She knew that she would age, that her beauty would fade, that one day she would die and become nothing more than a shade in the underworld. Her sisters, however, would remain. They would watch those same stars for untold millennia, unchanging and ageless. In that moment, a deep, unspoken understanding passed between them. They knew her time was short, and perhaps because of that, their protectiveness over her was fierce, absolute. This strange duality defined Medusa. She was the dutiful priestess of Athens, a symbol of order, piety, and civilization. But she was also the sister of ancient, monstrous beings, a child of the chaotic sea. She walked a line between two worlds, the world of mortal men and the world of immortal myths. This unique balance, this blend of divine family and mortal duty, made Medusa special. It gave her a depth that few others possessed, and it was this very quality, this shining, singular existence, that would attract the unwanted attention of a powerful and dangerous god. The piece of Medusa's life was a delicate thing, like a finely crafted piece of pottery. It was beautiful and well-ordered, but it could be shattered in an instant. The danger did not come from the world of mortals, who revered her, nor from her strange and distant family, who loved her. The danger came from above. It came from Olympus. The ancient Greeks understood a terrifying truth about their gods. Their desires were often inescapable, their attentions accursed disguised as a blessing. For a mortal, attracting the gaze of a god was one of a life's greatest perils, and the gaze that fell upon Medusa was that of Poseidon, lord of the seas. Poseidon was one of the three most powerful gods in the pantheon. He was a brother to Zeus, king of the gods, and Hades, ruler of the underworld. When they had divided the cosmos, Poseidon had claimed the seas as his domain. His power was absolute within that realm. With his trident, a fearsome weapon forged by the Cyclopes, he could stir the waters into a furious storm or calm them into a glassy peace. But his power was not limited to the ocean. He was also the god of earthquakes, earning the title Earthshaker. He could make the very foundations of the world tremble. His temperament was known to be as volatile and mercurial as the sea itself. He was prone to fits of rage, his wrath as destructive as a tidal wave. There was another, more personal reason for his gaze to be so dangerous. Poseidon held a bitter, long-standing rivalry with Athena. The two had once famously competed for the patronage of the great city of Athens. Poseidon had struck the rock of the Acropolis with his trident, bringing forth a spring of salt water. Athena, in her wisdom, had gifted the people the olive tree, a source of food, oil, and wood. The people and the other gods who judged the contest chose Athena's gift. The city was named for her, and the Parthenon, Medusa's home, was the ultimate symbol of Poseidon's defeat. He had never forgiven the slight. His pride was a raw, festering wound. For such a god to turn his attention to Athena's most beautiful and devoted priestess was not merely an act of desire, it was an act of aggression. It was a calculated insult, a way to defile the sanctity of his rival's most sacred space. Medusa, in her innocence and piety, became a pawn in a divine game she did not even know was being played. Mortals had no recourse against such whims. Piety was a shield, but it was not an absolute one. Against the full force of an Olympian's will, it was as fragile as glass. The change in the temple was subtle at first. One evening, as Medusa was performing the final rites of the day, she felt a sudden, inexplicable chill in the warm temple air. It was a cold that seemed to come from deep within the marble floors, a damp cold that carried with it a faint, briny scent. It was the smell of the deep ocean, of salt and crushed shells, a smell that had no place here, so high on the Acropolis, far from the shore. She paused, her hand hovering over the sacred flame. The flame, usually so steady, flickered violently, as if disturbed by a powerful, unseen wind. Then came the tremor. It was not a violent shaking, but a low, resonant vibration that she felt through the soles of her feet. It was a deep hum that seemed to make the very columns of the Parthenon groan. It was the signature of the Earthshaker, and with it came the most terrifying sensation of all, the feeling of being watched. It was an intense, possessive gaze that seemed to press in on her from all sides. It felt impossible to escape. There was no one else in the sanctuary, yet she had never felt so completely not alone. The presence was immense, ancient, and filled with a terrible, focused desire. It was the unwanted gaze of a god. The peace of Medusa's life had been broken. The gaze of a god is a promise of change, and for a mortal, such change is rarely a blessing. Her sacred world was now standing on the precipice of desecration. The ancient Greeks believed that the jealousy of the gods was one of the most dangerous forces in the universe. As you reflect on Medusa's story so far, what do you think is the true price of beauty in a world governed by such powerful whims. The presence in the temple now had a voice. It was not a sound that entered the ears so much as it settled in the bones, a deep, resonant boom that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the earth. It was the voice of the sea, of the deep places of the world, and it shook the marble columns of the Parthenon. Medusa, frozen in terror, looked up from the sacred flame she was tending. A form was coalescing in the shadows of the great hall, a figure of immense power and raw, divine energy. This was not a god disguised in mortal flesh. This was Poseidon, the Earthshaker, in his full and terrible glory. The air grew thick, heavy with an overwhelming pressure that made it difficult to breathe. It was the physical manifestation of a major god's presence, an elemental force that warped the very fabric of reality around it. The beautiful mosaics on the walls, depicting Athena's triumphs, seemed to shimmer and distort as if seen through water. The serene faces of the statues that lined the sanctuary appeared to twist in silent screams. Medusa's world, once so ordered and stable, was dissolving into a nightmare. Her first instinct was a prayer. She sent a silent, desperate plea to her patron, to the goddess whose home this was. She was in a place of Asilia, a sacred sanctuary where even the most wanted criminal was supposed to be safe from violence. To commit an act of aggression here was unthinkable, a crime so heinous it was believed to bring divine retribution upon an entire city. But Poseidon was not a criminal. He was a god, and he operated by a different set of laws. He saw the temple not as a sanctuary, but as the heart of his rival's power. He saw Medusa not as a devout priestess, but as a beautiful prize, and a means to inflict the ultimate insult upon Athena. Her piety, her devotion, the vow of chastity she held so dear, these were not shields. To him they were nothing. He moved towards her, and with every step, the floor of the temple trembled. Medusa scrambled backwards, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was a fragile, mortal thing in the face of an elemental force, a wild creature of the sea. There was nowhere to run. Her cry for help was a choked, desperate sound that was swallowed by the immense space of the inner sanctum, the holy Naos where the cult statue of Athena stood. But even if it had been heard, who would have dared to intervene? What mortal or lesser deity would stand against the brother of Zeus? The silence of the other gods, the cold indifference of Olympus, was its own kind of violence. It underscored the brutal, unwritten law of the cosmos. The powerful do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Her faith had taught her that devotion would be rewarded, that purity would be protected. That was the covenant between mortals and the divine. Now, she was learning the terrifying truth that this covenant could be broken at any time by any god who willed it. Her piety had offered her no protection at all. The event itself was a cataclysm, a violation that shattered more than just her body. It shattered her faith, her identity, her very soul. It was an act of sacrilege committed in the most sacred space she knew, before the golden eyes of the goddess she had given her life to. The poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, would later write of this moment, cementing it in the minds of generations to come. But his words could only hint at the profound horror of it. When the divine energy receded, when Poseidon was gone, a silence fell upon the temple. It was a silence heavier and more terrible than any sound. It was the silence of desecration. The air was now tainted with miasma, a ritual pollution that clung to the marble and the gold. the sacred space was unclean, and in the center of it all, a broken young woman lay on the cold stone floor, her world in ruins. The sacrilege is complete, the temple is defiled, and a broken Medusa is left in the ruins of her faith. But her ordeal is not over. The owner of this sacred space is about to arrive. In the crushing silence that followed Poseidon's departure, a new light began to fill the sanctuary. It was not the warm, golden light of the sun, nor the soft, gentle light of the sacred flame. This was a brilliant, blinding light, as cold and as sharp as a shard of ice. It seared the eyes and offered no comfort. Medusa, huddled on the floor, looked up with a flicker of desperate hope. It was her. Athena had come. Surely she had heard her priestess's prayer. Surely she was here to offer comfort, to seek justice, to mend the broken world. But when the light coalesced into the form of the goddess, Medusa saw the face of a stranger. This was not the serene, wise protector whose statue she cleaned every morning. This was Athena Promachos, the warrior goddess, formidable and merciless. Her famous gray eyes, so often celebrated for their wisdom, were not filled with sympathy. They were filled with a cold, hard fury that chilled Medusa to her very soul. The goddess's voice, when she spoke, was not booming like Poseidon's. It was chillingly calm, precise, and as sharp as newly chipped obsidian. And her words were not of comfort. They were of condemnation. In the cruel and often incomprehensible logic of the gods, the crime that had been committed was not the violation of a mortal woman. The crime was the defilement of a sacred temple. The concept of purity was paramount to a maiden goddess like Athena, and Medusa, through no fault of her own, was now impure. Her chastity had been stolen from her, and in doing so, she had become a living symbol of the temple's desecration. She was an offense to the goddess she served. This was the brutal reality of victim blaming in the world of myth. The mortal, being the weaker party, was almost always the one punished for a god's transgression. A terrifying realization dawned on Medusa as she looked at the enraged goddess. Athena could not punish Poseidon. He was her uncle, her peer in power, a fellow Olympian whose domain was vast and whose wrath was legendary. To act against him directly would be to risk a catastrophic war among the gods. Her anger, therefore, immense and righteous, had nowhere to go, and so it was redirected. It was funneled from the untouchable god to the vulnerable mortal who bore the evidence of his crime. Medusa was simply an easier target. The symbols of Athena, the wise owl, and the peaceful olive tree stood in stark, silent contrast to the violence of the judgment she was about to deliver. It was a chilling reminder that the Greek gods were deeply anthropomorphic, possessing all the emotional flaws of humans' jealousy, pride, and a capacity for terrifying, irrational rage. "You have brought this filth into my house," Athena declared, her voice devoid of any warmth. Medusa tried to speak, to explain, but her words were just choked sobs. How could she defend herself against a goddess who had already made up her mind? There was no court of appeal for divine judgment. A god's sentence was absolute, and it was immediate. A cold weight settled in Medusa's soul. It was the feeling of a terrifying, divine judgment being passed, a verdict from which there was no escape. The air grew sharp with the sterile, ozone smell of divine power being gathered. Athena raised a hand, and the curse began to take shape. The goddess spoke of a divine irony. It was Medusa's beauty, her lovely hair, that had attracted Poseidon's profane gaze. Therefore, that beauty would become the source of a new and terrible monstrosity. The punishment would serve as a warning to all other mortals about the dangers of getting entangled with the gods. A lesson written on the body of a single, unlucky priestess. In some later interpretations, scholars would try to find a sliver of mercy in the act, suggesting it was a twisted form of protection, a way of making Medusa so hideous that no man would ever dare to harm her again. But for Medusa, lying on the floor as the curse began to take hold, there was no mercy. There was only injustice. The sentence has been passed. Now, the cruel magic begins to unmake the woman Medusa was, twisting her into something unrecognizable. The transformation did not happen all at once. It was a slow, creeping horror, a violation of her very biology that she was forced to experience with full, horrifying awareness. The curse began, as Ovid would later write, with her hair. It had been her pride, a glorious cascade of silken strands that caught the light. The first sensation was a strange, tingling feeling on her scalp, as if 1,000 ants were crawling beneath the skin. Then came the movement. She felt her hair begin to writhe, to twist and coil with a life of its own. She raised a trembling hand to her head, expecting to feel the familiar softness. Instead, her fingers brushed against something cold, smooth, and scaly. She recoiled with a gasp of terror. Looking at her hand, she saw a single, long strand of her hair coiling around her wrist. It was no longer hair. It was a slender, green viper, its black eyes glittering, its forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. A wave of nausea and disbelief washed over her. She could feel all of it now, the weight of 100 living serpents where her hair once was, their bodies slithering against each other, a constant, unsettling motion on her head. A faint hissing sound now filled her ears. It was not coming from the temple shadows. It was coming from her. It was a sound that would follow her for the rest of her long, cursed life, a constant reminder of what she had become. Her body felt strange, heavy and leaden, as if her own limbs were slowly turning to stone. The curse was working its way through her, inverting everything she had once been. The pious priestess was becoming a creature of terror. The beautiful woman was becoming a monster. But the most terrible part of the curse was yet to be revealed. She stumbled out of the polluted temple, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She needed to see, to understand what was happening to her. The sun had set, and the courtyard was bathed in moonlight. A small pool of rainwater, gathered in a hollow of the stone, offered a reflection. Hesitantly, she leaned over it. The face that stared back was not her own. It was the face of a nightmare. The eyes were wide with terror, but it was the crown of writhing, hissing snakes that defined the image. A guttural scream tore from her throat, but it sounded strange, more like a rasping hiss than a human cry. Her voice was changing to another piece of her humanity being stripped away. As she screamed, a small nightbird, attracted by the sound, swooped down from the eaves of the Parthenon. It flew past her face, and for a fleeting second, its eyes met hers. In that instant, the bird's flight faltered. Its wings froze mid-beat, its body stiffened, and it dropped from the sky like a stone. It hit the ground with a sharp crack. Medusa crept closer, her heart pounding. The bird was perfectly preserved, every feather in place, but it was no longer flesh and blood. It was a tiny, gray statue. The horror of her new reality crashed down upon her with the weight of a mountain. It was her gaze. Her eyes, once windows to a gentle soul, were now weapons. They turned living flesh to stone. The curse was complete. It was designed for perfect, absolute isolation. She could never again look upon a living being with affection, with friendship, or even with simple curiosity without destroying it. The psychological trauma was immense. Her body, the only thing she truly owned, was now a weapon she could not control, a prison that would keep her alone forever. The transformation is complete. The priestess is gone, and a creature of terrible power stands in her place. She cannot stay where she is. The world of humans is now her greatest danger, and she theirs. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Medusa's grief. She had to run. She could not stay on the Acropolis, in the city she had loved. She was now a monster, a creature that belonged to the untamed wilderness, to the chaotic world outside the ordered walls of the city-state. The polis, her very presence was a threat to every living thing in Athens. She had been banished not by a formal vote of ostracism, but by a divine curse that made her an outcast from all civilization. She waited for the deepest point of the night, when the moon was hidden by clouds and the streets were empty. Then she began her flight. She ran on the cold, hard cobblestones of the Panathenaic Way, the same path she had once walked with grace and reverence. Now, her every footstep was a panicked flight from a world that was no longer hers. A stray dog barked from an alley, and she instinctively looked towards the sound. The barking cut off abruptly, replaced by a yelp of surprise that faded into an unnatural silence. She squeezed her eyes shut, the hissing of the snakes on her head, a frantic chorus of her own terror. She learned quickly to keep her gaze fixed on the ground before her. Her passing did not go entirely unnoticed. A man, woken by the sound of her running, opened his shuttered window to look out. He caught only a glimpse of a strange figure dashing through the shadows, but it was enough. He let out a panicked scream. Doors slammed shut, bolts were thrown. The city that had once revered her now recoiled from her in terror. In the dim light, her own shadow, cast long and distorted on the stone walls, was a monstrous caricature that seemed to chase her. It was a terrifying reflection of her new self. Finally, she reached the city gates. She slipped through them and into the darkness beyond, leaving the safety and familiarity of the city walls behind. The scratch of rough terrain and the biting cold of the wind were a harsh welcome to her new life. Ancient Greece was a collection of city-states, but between them lay vast stretches of wild, untamed land, forests and mountains filled with real dangers, like wolves and boars, and mythical ones whispered about in stories. This was her world now. This was her prison. The journey was one of utter loneliness. No one would offer her aid. No one would give her shelter. The psychological toll was immense. To see the faces of fellow humans contort in fear, to know that her mere presence brought terror, was a unique and terrible form of suffering. She was heading, without a clear destination, towards the ends of the earth. In the geography of myth, this was where monsters dwelled, in unmapped lands, far from the light of civilization. It was the only place she could go. This journey was her final, heartbreaking goodbye to the life she had known, to the woman she had been. It was the beginning of her forced acceptance of a new, monstrous existence. Somewhere in the remote corners of the world, her immortal sisters, Steno and Euryale, would eventually hear of her fate. They would seek her out, their fierce, protective love, the only comfort she would ever know again. But for now, she was utterly, completely alone. Having fled the world of mortals, Medusa must now find a new home, a place so remote that she can neither harm nor be harmed. Her life as a woman is over. Her eternity as a myth is about to begin. Athena's punishment was directed at Medusa, but it was Poseidon's actions that caused the tragedy. As we pause here, I invite you to share your thoughts. In myths or in life, where have you seen a story where justice truly missed its mark? The flight from the world of men was a long and desperate blur of terror and instinct. Medusa traveled under the cloak of night, hiding from the sun and from the innocent eyes that she could so easily destroy. She crossed rugged mountains and dark forests, a ghost haunted by her own monstrous form. But eventually, the land gave way to the endless sea. Driven by a primal urge she did not understand, she swam, leaving the continent of humanity behind, journeying ever westward, towards the place where the sun drowned itself each evening. She swam until her cursed, immortal body ached with a phantom exhaustion, until she found it, an island. It rose from the deep ocean like the jagged tooth of some long-dead sea creature, a fortress of black, volcanic rock against which the waves of the endless ocean crashed in a constant, rhythmic surge. This was the place, the Isle of Serpents, the end of the world, and her new home. The island was a study in desolation, a place of harsh and unforgiving beauty. There were no gentle slopes or lush meadows here, only sharp cliffs, sea-worn stone, and hardy, salt-stunted trees that clung to the rock with gnarled roots. The air was permanently damp, thick with the salty, clean smell of sea spray and wet stone that permeated everything. This scent would become the constant perfume of her new existence, a fragrance of profound and unending isolation. She found shelter in a deep, dark cave, its entrance facing the sea. The air within was cool and still, a welcome respite from the sun that she now feared. The cave became her sanctuary and her prison, a place that kept the world safe from her and her safe from the world. The constant, rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the rocks became the new metronome of her life. It was a sound of immense power and eternal loneliness, a lullaby for a creature who would never truly sleep. In this solitude, the passage of time began to dissolve. What was a day, a week, a year? The sun rose, casting a path of gold across the water that she could not look at. The moon waxed and waned, its silver light painting the rocks in ghostly shades. The seasons changed, marked only by the shifting temperature of the wind and the subtle alterations in the gray-green color of the sea. But for Medusa, nothing changed. Her state was one of perfect, agonizing stasis. Her body did not age, her curse did not fade, her sorrow did not lessen. It simply was. Her daily existence became a quiet routine of observation. She would sit in the mouth of her cave, her gaze carefully directed downwards at the tide pools, watching the tiny, mindless creatures that lived within them. She could watch the gulls as they circled high overhead, their cries faint on the wind, but she could never get close. Every living thing was a potential victim, a reminder of the weapon her eyes had become. The only constant sound, besides the sea, was the soft, rustling, slithering noise of her own serpent hair. It was a sound that had once driven her to the edge of madness. But now it was simply there, a nest of quiet companions in the crushing silence. One day, as another meaningless season turned, she sensed them, two figures standing on the shore. Her first instinct was terror, a panicked urge to hide, to shield them from her deadly gaze. But as she looked at their silhouettes against the gray sky, she recognized them. It was not their forms, which were as wild and ancient as the island itself, but their presence. The deep, primordial power that resonated from them was unmistakable. It was Steno and Uririle. Her immortal sisters had found her. Their arrival was not one of joyous cries or tearful embraces. They, who were born of ancient forces, did not communicate with such human displays. They simply came to her, their strange, powerful faces unreadable but for a deep, shared grief that passed between them in the silence. They had heard of her fate, and they had come to share her exile. They were her only companionship, a silent testament to the strange and powerful bond of their sisterhood. And so, the three of them became the genius loci, the spirits of the place. Their ancient sorrow and Medusa-esque cursed tragedy seeped into the very rock and air of the island, making it a place of profound, palpable melancholy, a lonely land for a lonely god. In this quiet solitude, years, decades, and centuries may pass, but her isolation is not absolute. Occasionally, the world of men intrudes, leaving behind silent, tragic monuments to her curse. The first time it happened, a storm had swept across the western ocean, driving a small fishing boat far from its intended course. The vessel was splintered against the island's black rocks, and a single survivor, a young man, managed to pull himself ashore. Medusa heard his cries for help from deep within her cave. A part of her, the ghost of the priestess she once was, felt a surge of compassion, a desire to offer aid. But she knew she could not. She remained hidden in the darkness, listening as he stumbled through the rocks, his calls growing more desperate. Eventually, he found the mouth of her cave, seeking shelter. He peered into the gloom, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. And in that instant, his gaze met hers. There was no sound, no flash of light. His cry was cut short, his body frozen in an instant. He remained there, half turned, his hand outstretched, his face a perfect mask of shock and terror. He was no longer a man of warm flesh and blood. He was a statue of cold, gray stone. Medusa let out a long, shuddering sigh, a sound that was half sob, half hiss. This was the true, unending horror of her curse. It was not just her loneliness, but the fact that her loneliness was a weapon, a danger to any soul who might accidentally breach it. Over the long years that followed, others came. A merchant ship, lost in the fog, a band of warriors, seeking fame and glory at the edge of the world. A young explorer, filled with the fire of discovery. Each one who found her, found the same instantaneous, silent end. Slowly, unintentionally, a garden of statues began to grow on the island. It was a horrifying parody of the art she had once admired in Athens. There, great sculptors like Praxiteles were celebrated for their genius in making cold marble seem like living flesh. Her curse did the opposite. It turned living flesh into cold marble. Her sculptures were not art, they were tragedies, each one a story of a life cut brutally short. She became the unwilling curator of her own tragic museum. The poses of the statues were unnatural, capturing the last, awkward, terrified moments of life. A sailor stood with his hands raised to shield his eyes. A soldier was frozen with his sword half drawn from its sheath. A merchant clutched a single, worthless coin in his stone hand. She came to know them all. In the long, empty hours, she would walk among them, her eyes always cast down. She would run her fingers over their stone forms, feeling the rough, weathered texture that had once been living skin. They were her only company, these silent, frozen figures. They were the physical manifestation of her curse, a landscape of her sorrow. As centuries crawled by, nature began to reclaim them. Moss grew in the crevices of a warrior's armor. A stubborn, flowering vine wrapped itself around the outstretched arm of a fisherman. A seabird, unafraid of the lifeless stone, built a nest on the shoulder of a young man whose face was forever fixed in a look of surprise. The wind would whistle between the silent figures, creating strange, mournful sounds, a sad music for her garden of the dead. In the moonlight, the pale stone would seem to glow, and the cruel light and deep shadows would sometimes make the statues look as if they were about to move, a heartbreaking trick of the eye that never failed to make her ancient sorrow feel new again. She did not create these forms in a fit of rage. She had no control over her power. It was instantaneous, absolute, and utterly tragic. And so she lived, the lonely goddess of a silent, stone population, forever trapped with the victims of her own sad story. As the lonely years pass, the woman Medusa fades, and the myth of the monster grows in the world of mortals, a story whispered by sailors who fear the western seas. Far from her island of sorrow, in the bustling port cities and quiet fishing villages of the Greek world, her story was being told. But it was not her true story. Myths in the ancient world were living things, passed from person to person through the spoken word. And like any story that is retold again and again, it began to change. With each telling, the complexities were stripped away, the tragedy forgotten, the injustice ignored. All that remained was the monster. We can almost imagine the scene. On a ship sailing through the dark waters of the Aegean, sailors huddle around a flickering oil lamp. The wind howls in the rigging, and an old, weathered mariner begins to speak. He tells of the Western Ocean, of the edge of the world where strange and terrible creatures dwell. And he speaks of the Gorgons, of 3 monstrous sisters who live on an island of stone. He speaks of one in particular, a creature so hideous that a single glance from her eyes can turn a man to solid rock. He speaks of her hair, a writhing nest of venomous snakes. He does not speak of a priestess. He does not mention a vow of chastity, a sacred temple, or the cruelty of 2 powerful gods. He speaks only of a monster. And in his telling, Medusa becomes a simple cautionary tale, a way to explain the dangers of unknown waters, a thrilling horror story to make the long nights at sea pass more quickly. This new narrative served a purpose. Heroes in the world of Greek myth needed monsters to slay. It was how they proved their worth, how they won glory, how they became legends themselves. And so Medusa, the victim, was slowly and methodically transformed into a narrative device, a terrifying obstacle for a future hero's journey. The truth of her life was an inconvenience to this new story, and so it was discarded. On the crude maps of the ancient world, in the unexplored regions at the western edge, illustrators would draw pictures of fearsome sea creatures. Here be dragons, here be gorgons. Her home became a place of imagined terror. There was a deeper, more subtle transformation happening as well. The fear of the monstrous feminine is a recurring theme in the myths of many cultures. Powerful female figures, those who exist outside the control of men and society, are often cast as dangerous beasts that must be conquered and slain. Medusa, with her deadly power and her isolated, independent existence, fit this archetype perfectly. Her name, which had once meant guardian or protectress, now became a synonym for terror. And all the while, Medusa herself knew nothing of this. She lived in a state of profound ignorance of her own monstrous fame. She could not know that her name was whispered in fear across 1,000 miles of sea. She was utterly disconnected, a ghost in her own story. The gods, of course, knew the truth. Athena, Poseidon, the others on Olympus, they knew how the priestess became the monster. But they were silent. They allowed the false narrative to grow, perhaps because it suited them. It erased their own culpability, their own cruelty, and replaced it with a simple, clean story of a hero slaying a beast. It is a timeless lesson in how history and myth are so often written by the powerful. As Medusa sat in the mouth of her cave, feeling the wind that had traveled from distant lands, carrying with it faint, unknowable scents, she felt only a deep sense of peace. It was the peace of utter detachment. The world of men, with its stories and its fears, was no longer her world. The wheeling constellations above were the same stars seen by the people who feared her, but she felt no connection to them. In her complete and total isolation, she had found a strange and sorrowful freedom. The myth has been written, the monster created, and now a hero will be sent to slay it. The whispers on the wind have finally reached the ears of a king, setting in motion the final act of Medusa's story. For countless years, the rhythm of Medusa's life had been the rhythm of the waves, a pattern of unending, sorrowful peace. But one day, the pattern was broken. It began with an unnatural stillness in the air. The gulls that usually circled high above the island were gone. The constant murmur of the sea seemed to hush, the waves lapping gently at the shore instead of crashing. A profound silence fell, a silence that felt heavier than the usual quiet of her lonely world. Medusa, from the darkness of her cave, sensed the change. An ancient, weary part of her knew what it meant. After all this time, someone was coming. And this was not another lost sailor. This was something else. Her first glimpse of the intruder was not of a man, but of a strange, impossible light. At the entrance to her dark cave, a piece of the sky seemed to have fallen to earth, a glint of polished bronze that caught the faint light and shone with a brilliance that did not belong in her world of gray rock and dark water. It was a shield, polished to a perfect mirror finish, and it was a shield she recognized. Emblazoned upon it, almost invisible in the reflection, was the faint image of an owl. It was a symbol of Athena. In that moment, the final, ultimate cruelty of her fate settled upon her. The goddess had not been content to simply curse her and abandon her. Now, she had sent a champion to finish the job. She had actively assisted in this final act of destruction. It was a betrayal so deep, so absolute, that it no longer sparked rage, only a profound, bone-deep weariness. The hero's name was Perseus. He had been sent on this impossible quest by a jealous king, a dare he was never meant to survive, but he was divinely aided. He wore the winged sandals of Hermes that allowed him to fly across the sea, and on his head was Hades' helm of invisibility, which shielded him from sight. He had been guided here by the Gree Medusa's own sisters, whom he had tricked and blackmailed into revealing the way. He was not just a warrior, he was an instrument of the god's will, and in his hand he carried a sword of adamantine, a blade sharp enough to sever an immortal neck. From Medusa's perspective, he was just another intruder, but one who was strangely, impossibly prepared. She could feel his presence, even if she could not see him. He was a ripple in the stillness of her existence. As he approached, she and her sisters were asleep, a rare moment of peace in their long, sorrowful lives. It was perhaps the only mercy she was granted in the end, that she was slain in a moment of vulnerability, unaware, not having to face her executioner. Perseus, guided by Athena's whispers, did not look at Medusa directly. He looked only at her reflection in the polished shield, a distorted, monstrous image of the creature she had become. For a fleeting moment, Medusa, in her dream state, saw it too. She saw the reflection of her own face, the snakes writhing slowly in her sleep, and she felt not terror, but a distant pity for the creature in the bronze. She felt a cold, sharp shock at her neck. It was not a searing pain, but a sudden, final release. The weight of her head, the constant hissing, the burden of her deadly gazet was all gone. A quiet darkness rushed in, a peaceful void she had unknowingly longed for centuries. And so, in the quiet darkness of her cave, Medusa's long ordeal finally ended. The woman who prayed to Athena, the victim of Poseidon's cruelty, the lonely exile on an island of stone sorrows, was at last free from her severed neck. A final, strange miracle occurred. Her 2 unborn children by Poseidon, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, the giant, sprang forth, life erupting from the site of her death. Her sisters, Steno and Euryale, awoke with cries of rage and grief, pursuing the invisible hero as he fled. But it was too late. The curse was broken. Her story reminds us that behind every myth there is a truth, and often, behind every monster, there is a tragedy. Thank you for journeying with me through her forgotten life. I hope her story has brought you a sense of peace. As you continue to drift and relax, may your own thoughts be gentle and your rest be deep. The threads of Medusa's life, woven with injustice and sorrow, had been cut. Her story, however, was far from over. It did not end with the final beat of her heart or the last hiss of the serpents in her hair. Instead, it fractured, like light through a prism, creating new legends that would ripple across the ages. Her essence lingered, a powerful echo in the world of gods and mortals. The tale that follows is not one of adventure, but of legacy. It is a quiet exploration of what remains when a life is taken, and how a power, once feared, finds new and unexpected forms. We will follow the silent journey of her head, a terrible weapon and a potent symbol. We will witness the birth of her children, creatures of wonder, born from an act of violence. And we will reflect on how her face, once a curse, became an icon, carved into stone and into the very fabric of human culture. This is the story of Medusa's long and quiet afterlife. Her slayer, the hero Perseus, did not keep his terrible prize for long. His quest was done, his promise to King Polydex ready to be fulfilled. But a trophy of such immense power, a weapon that held the gaze of death itself, was not something a mortal could possess forever. It belonged to the world of the divine, a force to be wielded by those who ruled from the heights of Mount Olympus. And so, with a heart full of awe, and perhaps a measure of fear, Perseus sought out the goddess who had guided his hand. He went to Athena, the very being whose anger had set Medusa's fate in motion. In the imagined silence of the Olympian halls, one can picture the scene. The air is still and heavy with divine energy. Light from an unseen source glints off polished marble floors before the tall, gride goddess of wisdom. Perseus presents the asterisk, Cabeces asterisk, the special bag that had safely contained the Gorgon's head. There is no triumph in this moment, only a solemn transfer of power. The hero, his duty complete, relinquishes the source of his victory. The goddess, her plan fulfilled, accepts the final piece of her fallen priestess. Athena took the head of Medusa, and, in a gesture of ultimate mastery, she placed it upon her own divine shield. This shield, known as the Aegis, was no ordinary piece of armor. It was one of the most powerful symbols in the entire Greek pantheon, a key attribute of both Athena and her father, Zeus. The legends surrounding its origin are many, but it was often described as a shield of gleaming, polished bronze, or sometimes as a protective cloak made from the hide of a goat. It was a symbol of divine authority, an object that could create storms and instill terror in the hearts of even the bravest warriors. It was a perfect, unassailable defense. Yet Athena, in her infinite and often chilling wisdom, saw a way to make it even more formidable. By mounting Medusa's head upon its center, the aegis was transformed. It was no longer just a symbol of divine power, but a vessel for it. The Gorgon's petrifying gaze, which had lost none of its potency in death, was now fused with Athena's shield. The goddess of strategy had effectively turned her victim's greatest and most terrible weapon into her own. Her shield no longer just protected her, it became an active force of destruction, capable of turning entire armies to stone with a single glance. A deep and haunting irony settled over Medusa's fate. The woman who was punished for being a victim now served as the ultimate symbol of protection for the very goddess who had destroyed her. This act marked a profound shift in Medusa's existence. She was no longer a specific being, a lonely creature living in a remote cave. She became something else entirely. She became an abstract symbol of what the Greeks called apotropaic magic. This is a simple but powerful idea. It is the belief that an image of something terrifying can be used to ward off evil and protect the innocent. A depiction of a frightening face could frighten away a real demon. The ultimate evil could be used to defeat lesser evils. Medusa, in death, became the most powerful apotropaic symbol in the ancient world. Her face, now known as the Gorgonion, began to appear everywhere. It was a face of contradictions, with its wide eyes, bared teeth, and tongue sticking out. Yet it was a sight that brought comfort to those it protected. Imagine an ancient Greek city, its high stone walls baking in the Mediterranean sun. Above the main gate, carved into the lintel, is the face of the Gorgon, a silent guardian, frightening away any who would bring harm to the citizens within. Her image promised safety. It promised that any approaching enemy would be met with a cold, unblinking power. Picture a soldier, a hoplite, preparing for the chaos of battle. His bronze armor is heavy, his helmet crested with horsehair. On the curved surface of his shield, the Gorgonion is painted or embossed, its terrifying features a stark warning. As he stands in the line, waiting for the signal to advance, he might draw courage from that fearsome face. It is a reminder that a divine, protective power is with him, a power that can turn his enemies to stone and send them fleeing in terror. The fear he sees on the shield is a fear he hopes to inspire in his foes. Even in the quiet moments of daily life, her presence could be felt. Think of a small personal amulet, perhaps carved from bone or molded from cool, heavy clay. A person might wear it around their neck, feeling its weight against their skin. The face on it would be a stylized Gorgon, a small token of protection against bad luck, illness, or the evil eye. It was a way of carrying a piece of a goddess's power, a piece of Medusa's curse, and turning it into a personal blessing. Her image was a shield for the common person, just as it was for the goddess Athena. This complete absorption of her power by the Olympians is perhaps the final, quiet tragedy of her story. Even in death, her body was not her own. It was a resource, a tool to be used to serve their grand purposes. She, who was named guardian or protectress, had her identity twisted into its most literal form. She became a guardian for Athena's temples, a guardian for Athena's chosen cities, and a guardian for the soldiers who fought in Athena's name. She fulfilled the promise of her name, but only by becoming a passive object, her will and her consciousness forever gone. The legends say that the head retained its full power, a magical battery that never faded. Its influence extended even to her blood, the very fluid of her life. According to some myths, Athena collected 2 drops of blood from Medusa's severed neck. She gave these potent drops to the great healer, Asclepius. 1 drop, taken from Medusa's right side, had the power to bring the dead back to life. The other, from her left side, was a fatal poison that could kill instantly. Even in her blood, there was this deep duality. She was both destruction and salvation, a curse and a cure, a monster and a savior. Her essence was a paradox, a source of ultimate harm and ultimate healing, a power too complex for the mortal world to fully comprehend. But as her head found its final resting place, becoming a symbol of power, the very moment of her death was also, miraculously, a moment of creation. From the wound in her neck, to legendary beings sprang forth into the light. As Perseus's sword sliced through Medusa's neck, her life force did not simply vanish. Instead, it erupted, giving birth to 2 new beings, the children of her tragic union with the sea god, Poseidon. They were her last living legacy, a testament to a moment of violation that was now transformed into a moment of creation. They were born fully formed, leaping from the wound as if released from a long imprisonment. One was a creature of sublime beauty and freedom, the other a figure of strength and power. They were Pegasus and Chrysos. Pegasus, the winged horse, is perhaps one of the most beloved and recognized creatures in all of Greek mythology. Imagine the sight, a magnificent white horse, its muscles powerful and sleek, with a pair of enormous, feathered wings unfolding from its back. He represented a freedom that Medusa, in her monstrous form, could never have known. He was a creature of the sky, of the wind, of endless possibility. As soon as he was born, he soared into the air, leaving the dark, blood-soaked island far behind him. It was as if he carried with him all the grace and beauty that had been stolen from his mother. He flew to Mount Helicon, a place sacred to the Muses, the goddesses of art, literature, and science. In this tranquil green landscape, Pegasus landed. He struck the earth with his hoof, and from that spot, a spring of fresh water began to bubble forth. This was the Hippocrene spring, whose waters were said to grant poetic inspiration to all who drank from them. The child of a horrifying event became the source of artistic beauty. One can almost hear the gentle sound of that bubbling spring, nestled in a quiet, mossy grove on the mountainside, a place of peace and creativity born from Medusa's sorrow. Later, Pegasus became the loyal mount of the hero Bellerophon. Together, they embarked on a famous quest to slay the Chimera, a fearsome, fire-breathing monster. The image of the hero on the back of the winged horse, soaring through the clouds to fight a creature from the depths of the earth, is one of pure heroic fantasy. Pegasus was a symbol of nobility, courage, and the power to rise above earthly challenges. He was everything his mother was not allowed to be. He was celebrated, admired, and loved. He was a hero's companion. After his adventures with Bellerophon came to an end, Pegasus did not simply fade away. He continued his ascent, flying all the way to Mount Olympus, the home of the gods. There, he was given a place of honor in the divine stables. His final duty was to serve Zeus himself, the king of the gods. He became the carrier of the thunderbolts, fetching the jagged spears of lightning for the sky god to wield. Imagine the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of a stable on Olympus, a divine light filling the air. Where this magnificent horse rests, his great wings folded at his side, a servant to the most powerful being in the cosmos. Medusa's other child is far less known, a more mysterious and formidable figure. His name was Chrysaor, which in ancient Greek means golden sword. He was not a creature of beauty, but one of immense power. He is often depicted as a giant, or sometimes even as a winged boar, a creature of untamed, earthly strength. He emerged alongside Pegasus, a silent, powerful being, holding a sword that gleamed like the sun. If Pegasus represented the white-crested waves of their father Poseidon's seas, then Chrysaor represented the god's divine wrath, the unstoppable power of a storm. Chrysaor's story is quieter than his brother's, but he too connects to the great heroic cycles of Greek myth. He became the father of a monstrous, three-bodied giant named Geryon. This giant Geryon lived on a remote island and owned a herd of magnificent red cattle. The hero Heracles, as part of his famous 12 labors, was tasked with stealing these cattle. To do so, he had to defeat and kill Chrysaor's son, and so Medusa's lineage, through her less famous child, intersected with the story of Greece's greatest hero. Her bloodline, though born of tragedy, flowed into the mainstream of myth and legend. The birth of these two children from such a violent act speaks to a powerful theme in mythology, the idea of creation from destruction. From the darkest moments, new life and new beauty can emerge. Pegasus, the inspiring artist, and Chrysaor, the powerful warrior, are two sides of the legacy their mother left behind. A crucial difference, however, lay in their nature. Medusa, once a mortal woman, was cursed and ultimately killed. Her children, born of a god and a mortal, were immortal. They would live forever, a strange and perhaps bittersweet injustice. They possessed a freedom in their eternal lives that their mother was never allowed in her short one. But before Medusa's head was given to Athena, and before her children began their own legendary journeys, her slayer had his own adventures, where her terrible power was wielded one last time. After leaving Medusa's island, Perseus began his long journey home. He carried the Gorgon's head carefully concealed in the Cabeces asterisk, the special bag given to him by the nymphs. He knew that its power was too great, too dangerous to be exposed by accident. It was a weapon of last resort, a silent, terrible power that he now controlled. His journey would take him across vast lands and seas, and on this path he would encounter both gods and monsters, and for a few he would unleash the Gorgon's final, chilling curse. His travels first took him to the far western edge of the world, where the Titan Atlas stood. Atlas bore an immense burden. As a punishment for fighting against the gods, he was condemned to hold up the heavens on his shoulders for all eternity. Imagine a vast mountain range that has the shape of a colossal, weary figure, its head bowed under an invisible, crushing weight. Perseus, a weary traveler, asked the Titan for hospitality and a place to rest. But Atlas, fearing a prophecy that a son of Zeus would one day steal his golden apples, refused the hero roughly. Perseus, angered by the refusal, decided to offer the Titan a gift. He told Atlas to close his eyes, and then he pulled Medusa's head from the bag. He held it up before the Titan's face. In that moment, a great and magical stillness fell over the world. The immense suffering of Atlas finally came to an end. His massive body began to transform. His limbs hardened into rock, his beard and hair became forests, and his shoulders and head formed the mountain peaks. He grew and grew until he became the Atlas Mountains of North Africa, a stone giant forever holding up the sky, at last finding a strange and silent peace. Medusa's gaze had not destroyed him, but had given him an eternal, unmoving rest. Continuing his journey, Perseus flew over the coast of Ethiopia. There he saw a sight of great distress. Chained to a desolate rock by the sea was a beautiful young woman, left as a sacrifice. The sound of waves crashed against the cliff where the lone figure waited for her doom. This was the princess Andromeda. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had boasted that she and her daughter were more beautiful than the Nereids, the divine sea nymphs. This act of hubris angered the sea god Poseidon, who sent a terrible sea monster called Cetus to ravage the kingdom. An oracle declared that the only way to appease the monster was to sacrifice the princess. Perseus, moved by her plight, flew down to face the beast as it rose from the dark waters. The monster was colossal, a creature of scales and teeth and rage. Some versions of the story say Perseus fought it with his divine sword, a long and bloody battle. But other versions say he once again used his most powerful weapon. As Cetus lunged towards Andromeda, Perseus revealed the Gorgon's head. The monster's furious charge slowed, its roar dying in its throat. The heavy, magical stillness fell once more, and the great sea beast was turned to stone, its terrifying form frozen forever in the waves. Perseus freed Andromeda from her chains, and in that moment, a feeling of relief and safety washed over the land. He had saved the innocent and punished the monster. He would later marry Andromeda, and together they would found a dynasty, their descendants said to be the ancestors of the Persians. This heroic tale of a hero, a princess, and a monster was so profound that the gods placed all of its characters in the night sky. On a clear, dark night, you can still trace the outlines of the constellations, Perseus and Andromeda, Queen Cassiopeia, and even the monster Cetus, forever chasing each other across the heavens. Perseus's work was still not done. He used the head to defeat Phineus, Andromeda's jealous uncle, who tried to claim her for himself. And upon returning to his home island of Seriphos, he found that his mother was in danger. Hiding from the aggressive King Polydex, Perseus strode into the king's court, where Polydex and his followers mocked him, refusing to believe he had completed his quest. In response, Perseus declared his proof was at hand. He averted his own eyes and revealed the Gorgon's face one last time. The king and his entire court were turned to stone, silent statues in a silent room. In all these instances, Perseus's use of the head is purely instrumental. There is no malice in his actions, only the cold, efficient application of a powerful tool. In a final, strange twist of fate, Medusa's curse was used to punish the proud, to rescue the innocent, and to bring a tyrant to justice. The power that had isolated and destroyed her became a force for heroic deeds. Medusa herself was absent from these events. She was simply a weapon, her final acts in the world carried out by the man who had killed her. Her story ends with her power being used, absorbed, and finally immortalized. But the image of her face, the very source of that power, would go on its own long journey through the centuries. The face of Medusa, which once turned living flesh to cold, hard stone, was itself captured in stone by countless artists. Her image has traveled through time, changing and evolving with each passing era. To trace its journey is to see how a culture's deepest fears, anxieties, and ideals can be projected onto the face of a single myth. Let us imagine we are walking through a quiet museum, a place where time slows down. Each gallery we enter shows us a different Medusa, a new interpretation of her ancient and powerful story. In our first gallery, dedicated to archaic Greece from the 8th to the 6th centuries before the Common Era, the images are raw and terrifying. We see her face on fragments of pottery and on rough terracotta tiles that once decorated the roofs of temples. This is the original Gorgonian. It is not the face of a beautiful woman. It is a broad, round face with a wide, manic grin, showing sharp tusks like a boar. A thick, lolling tongue hangs from her mouth, and her eyes bulge with a primal energy. This face was not designed to be beautiful or tragic. It was designed to be powerfully, viscerally frightening. It was a mask of pure terror, meant to ward off evil by being more horrifying than any evil it might encounter. We move now into the next gallery, that of the classical period in the 5th and 4th centuries. Here, a profound change has occurred. The artists of this golden age began to humanize their gods and monsters. The grotesque mask of the Gorgon softens. The tusks recede. The wild grin is replaced by a more subtle expression. On a painted vase, we see her not as a monstrous head, but as a full figure, still with snakes for hair, but with the body of a woman. It is in this period that the story of her tragic beauty begins to take root. The artists are no longer just trying to scare the viewer. They are beginning to tell a more complex story. In the center of this room is a beautiful marble sculpture, a Roman copy of a lost Greek original. It is known as the Rondinine Medusa. We step closer to look at the smooth, cold stone. Here, she is undeniably beautiful. Her face is serene, her features classical and perfect. The snakes in her hair are still present, but they are stylized, almost like an elaborate hairstyle. Her head is bowed, her eyes are closed, and her expression is one of deep sorrow. This is not a monster. This is a beautiful woman at the moment of her death, a victim of a terrible fate. The horror has been replaced with pathos, with a deep and lingering sadness. We continue our walk, entering a gallery of Renaissance art. Here, one painting dominates the room. It is by the master Caravaggio, painted on a circular wooden shield. The deep, dark, glossy paint seems to pull us in. Medusa's head is shown at the very second it has been severed. Her eyes are wide with shock and horror. Her mouth is open in a silent scream. Blood streams from her neck. The snakes in her hair writhe in agony. Caravaggio has captured the raw humanity of the scene, the terror and the pain of a violent death. He forces us to see her not as a symbol or a monster, but as a living being in her final, desperate moments. The 19th century gallery shows us yet another transformation. The Romantics and the Symbolists became fascinated with her story. They saw her as a femme fatale, a figure of dangerous, irresistible allure. In their paintings and poems, she is often depicted as a beautiful, seductive woman, her serpentine hair a symbol of her deadly charm. She is both terrifying and captivating, a representation of a wild, untamable female power that both attracted and frightened the male artists of the era. Finally, we enter the quiet, clean space of a modern gallery. The hum of the climate control is the only sound. Here, contemporary artists have reinterpreted her image once again. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, feminist thinkers and artists reclaimed Medusa. They saw her story not as a monster tale, but as a powerful allegory for female rage against injustice. Her stony gaze was reimagined as a righteous weapon against a patriarchal world that so often blames the victim. Her face, once a symbol of monstrosity, became a symbol of survival, of rage, and of a woman's power to fight back. Her image appears on protest signs, and in modern art, her curse transformed into a defiant roar. As we leave our imagined museum, we see her face one last time, not on an artifact, but on a modern luxury product. The logo of the Versace fashion brand is the head of Medusa. Here, she represents beauty, power, and deadly allure. The face that was once a curse, a weapon, and a symbol of terror has become an enduring cultural icon, a brand, a piece of high fashion. The long journey of her image shows us that a story is never truly finished. Its meaning shifts and deepens, changing with the people who tell it. The simple tale of a monster in a cave has become a complex and timeless allegory for injustice, trauma, and the enduring power of a woman's story. Thus, the echoes of Medusa's life continue to resonate, her face carved in stone and her story retold through the ages. A tale that began in a sunlit temple found its end in darkness, only to be reborn as a symbol forever changing. As we let these thoughts settle, allow your mind to quiet and your breathing to deepen. The main story is at its end, and all that is left is to drift peacefully on the gentle waters of myth. The world of myth is vast and deep, like a quiet ocean at midnight. We have followed one current, the story of Medusa, to its end. But other currents flow in this great ocean, other stories that lie in the calm, silent depths. As you continue to rest, as your mind continues to soften, let us drift on these other currents for a while. There is no need to follow closely. There is no destination we must reach. These are simply echoes, gentle tales to accompany you on the final part of your journey into sleep. Think of them as soft, distant stars in a deep and peaceful sky. Medusa was not alone in the world. She had two sisters, Steno and Euryale. They were Gorgons, just as she was, but with one crucial difference. While Medusa was made mortal, a victim of a goddess's curse, her sisters were born immortal. They could not be harmed. They could not be killed. Their existence was as constant and as timeless as the rock of their lonely island home. They were not cursed into their form. They simply were asterisk. They were ancient beings, primordial deities, far older and more elemental than the shining gods of Olympus. Let us think for a moment about their names, for the names of ancient beings always hold a deep truth. The first sister was named Steno. This name, in the old tongue, means forceful one or the strong. She was said to be the most ferocious of the three, the most independent, and the most dangerous. One can imagine her as a being of immense power, a living embodiment of the raw physical force of nature. She was the strength of a great wave crashing against the shore. She was the unyielding hardness of granite. She was the fierce, protective anger of a wild creature guarding its home. Ancient writers claimed that Steno, with her own hands, had killed more men than even her petrifying sister, for she was the active, aggressive defender of their sanctuary. The other immortal sister was named Euryale. Her name holds a different kind of power. It means far-roaming, or perhaps wide-leaping. This name connects her to the vastness of the world, to the great open spaces. If Steno was the strength of the rock, then Euryale was the spirit of the boundless sea that surrounded it. Her essence was in the far horizon, in the endless expanse of water that met the sky. Perhaps she was the one who would fly furthest from their island, her powerful wings carrying her over the waves. Her gaze was fixed on the distance, a being whose nature was one of movement and expanse. She was the cry of the seabirds, the mournful and lonely sound of the wind blowing over an empty ocean. These two sisters, Steno and Euryale, represent a wild, untamable aspect of the cosmos. They were not like the Olympians, who took human form and involved themselves in the intricate dramas of mortal lives. The Gorgon sisters were a fact of nature, a known and feared reality that existed at the edge of the world. They had no temples built in their honor. They had no cults of worshippers who prayed to them. Mortals did not seek their favor. They simply knew that the Gorgons were there, and that their home was a place to be avoided. They were a boundary, a line on the map of the world, beyond which lay a power that was ancient, alien, and absolute. When Perseus came to their island, it was Medusa, the mortal one, whom he was sent to kill. Her sisters were not his target, for they could not be killed, but they were her protectors. They were her family. The myths tell us that when Perseus fled, his task complete, Steno and Euryale rose up and pursued him. One can picture the scene. Two powerful winged figures launching themselves from a cliff, their forms stark against the gray sky. But their pursuit was in vain. Perseus had his magical gifts, the winged sandals, to give him speed, the cap of darkness, to make him invisible. He slipped away from them, a ghost in the air. And what was left for the immortal sisters? Only their grief. This is one of the few emotions the ancient stories ever grant them. Their grief for their slain sister Medusa was said to be profound. Imagine the sound of their cries, not human sounds, but something more elemental, the sound of stone cracking, of wind howling through a desolate canyon. It was a cry of rage and sorrow that echoed over the empty water, a lament for the one part of their world that was not eternal. Their deep sisterly bond, a silent companionship that had lasted for ages, was now broken forever. Their ultimate fate is not clearly defined. It does not need to be. Their story is one of continuity. They simply continue to exist. They remain on their island at the edge of the world to beings who have only each other for all of eternity. Think of the immense, quiet weight of that existence, the feeling of immense age, of watching mountains slowly rise and continents drift. They would watch the stars in their slow, celestial dance, the constellations turning in the deep, silent sky above their home, unchanging for millennia. They are the quiet hum in the background of the Greek mythological world, a reminder of a power that is older and wilder than the gods themselves. The bond of the Gorgon sisters was a powerful one, but the power of the Olympian gods was absolute. Medusa was not the only mortal to suffer at the hands of a vengeful deity. Let us quietly recall the story of a gifted weaver in the ancient land of Lydia, a place famous for its brilliant purple dyes and its mastery of textiles. There lived a young woman named Arachne. She was not a princess, nor was she of noble birth. She was a simple maiden, but she possessed a gift that was divine in its perfection. Arachne was a weaver, and her skill at the loom was so great that people would travel from all over to simply watch her work. The nymphs themselves were said to creep out from their forests and rivers, to gaze in wonder at her creations. Her fingers moved with a speed and grace that was mesmerizing. The rhythmic, clicking sound of her loom filled the quiet room where she worked, a sound as steady and as peaceful as a sleeping heart. The threads she used were as fine as silk, and she could coax them into images so beautiful and so lifelike that they seemed to breathe. If you could have felt the soft, fine thread running through your fingers, you would have known it was something special. And to see one of her finished tapestries, rich with vibrant color and intricate detail, was to witness a masterpiece. But with this great gift came a great and dangerous pride. The Greeks called this pride hubris, an arrogance so profound that it made a mortal forget their place in the grand order of the universe. People whispered that Arachne's skill must surely be a gift from the goddess Athena, the patron of all weavers and craftspeople. But Arachne would scoff at this. She declared that her skill was her own, that she had learned nothing from Athena, and that if the goddess herself wanted a challenge, Arachne would gladly face her in a contest. Such words do not go unheard by the gods. Athena, wishing to be merciful, decided to give the young weaver a chance to repent. She appeared in Arachne's workshop, disguised as a frail old woman. She gently warned the girl, advising her to be content with being the best among mortals, and to ask the goddess for forgiveness for her reckless words. But Arachne was dismissive. She mocked the old woman and repeated her challenge, her pride blinding her to the danger she was in. And so Athena revealed her true form, and the contest was set. 2 looms were placed in the room, and the quiet, focused atmosphere of 2 masters at their craft filled the space. They began to weave, locked in silent competition. Athena's tapestry was a work of divine majesty. In its center, she wove the scene of her contest with Poseidon for the city of Athens. In the corners, she depicted cautionary tales, mortals who had dared to defy the gods and who had been terribly punished for their pride. Her work was a clear and powerful warning. Arachne, however, chose a very different subject. Her tapestry was a work of subversive and dangerous beauty. She wove a series of scenes depicting the gods in their worst moments. She showed them deceiving and mistreating mortals, their many transgressions and injustices laid bare for all to see. Her work was a direct and fearless insult to the rulers of Olympus. And the most infuriating thing of all, the detail that sealed her fate, was that her work was utterly flawless. It was perfect. It was, perhaps, even more beautiful than Athena's own. The goddess, enraged by the insult and by the undeniable perfection of Arachne's skill, could not contain her fury. She took her shuttle and ripped Arachne's beautiful tapestry to shreds. Then she struck the young maiden on the forehead, filling her with a sudden, unbearable sense of shame and despair. Arachne, unable to live with her humiliation, tied a rope to the ceiling and hanged herself. But Athena's actions were not yet finished. She took a form of cruel and chilling pity. As Arachne's body hung in the air, the goddess touched her and whispered a final transformation. Arachne's form began to shrink and change. Her nose and ears disappeared. Her fingers grew long and spindly. She was transformed into the world's first spider. She was cursed to hang and to weave for all of eternity. The story served as a powerful lesson to the ancient Greeks about the dangers of excessive pride. And to this day, the class of creatures that includes the spiders still bears her name, Arachnid. The image of a tiny spider patiently spinning a delicate, complex web in a quiet sunbeam is the final, sad echo of a girl whose skill was too great for her own good. Pride was a dangerous quality for a mortal, but so too was love, especially a mother's love, when it challenged the honor of the gods. Consider the sad tale of Queen Niobe. In the great city of Thebes, there lived a queen named Niobe. She was married to King Amphion, and her life was one of immense happiness and good fortune. Her greatest source of pride and joy was her children. She had 14 of them, 7 strong and handsome sons, and 7 beautiful and graceful daughters. Imagine a grand, sunlit courtyard in her palace, a place filled with the constant sound of the laughter of many children. Niobe's heart was full. She believed herself to be the most blessed of all mortal women. This deep pride in her family, however, eventually turned into the same fatal flaw that doomed Arachne, hubris. During a festival honoring the goddess Leto, Niobe began to boast to the women of Thebes. She questioned why they worshipped Leto, a goddess who had only 2 children, when she, Niobe, a mortal queen, had 7 times that number. She mocked the goddess, claiming that her own happiness and fertility made her superior. She was so proud of her own life that she saw no reason to show humility before the divine. Leto, on the island of Delos, heard this boast, and her divine honor was wounded. She called to her 2 children, the twin gods, Apollo and Artemis. They were gods of the bow-bringers, of both healing and sudden, unseen death. Leto asked them to avenge her honor against the proud queen who had mocked her, and so, wrapped in clouds, the 2 gods descended from the heavens. Apollo, the god of the silver bow, went to the fields where Niobe's 7 sons were practicing their athletics. A sudden, profound silence fell over the sunlit fields. One by one, the glint of a silver arrow flashed in the sky. One by one, the sons of Niobe fell, each struck down by the unerring aim of the vengeful god. The sounds of youthful sport were replaced by an eerie, unnatural quiet. Meanwhile, Artemis, the goddess of the golden bow, went to the palace where Niobe's daughters were gathered. She too let her arrows fly, silent and swift messengers of death. One by one, the daughters fell, their laughter cut short. Niobe, hearing the commotion, rushed to her children, only to see her last daughter die in her arms. In the space of a single afternoon, her entire world of happiness was destroyed. Her vibrant, joyful home became a house of silent, unbearable sorrow. Niobe's grief was absolute. It was a sorrow so deep, so heavy, that it felt as if it could turn the very world to stone. She sat among the bodies of her 14 children, weeping without end. Seeing her overwhelming pain, Zeus, the king of the gods, took a form of pity on her. He transformed her into a rock on her homeland's Mount Sipylus. Her body became stone, a permanent, unmoving monument to her loss. But even in this form, her grief did not cease. A spring of water began to flow from the rock face, and it was said that even as stone, Niobe continued to weep for her lost children. This place, the Weeping Rock on Mount Sipylus in modern-day Turkey, is still associated with this ancient and tragic myth. You can still see a rock formation that resembles a woman's face, with water perpetually seeping from it like tears. Imagine the sight of that lonely mountain and the gentle sound of a trickling stream in a quiet, mountainous landscape. It is the sound of a mother's endless sorrow, a story that became part of the land itself. Like the tale of Arachne, it served as a powerful cautionary tale for the ancient world, a story about the terrible consequences of daring to compare oneself to the gods. These stories of Medusa, of Arachne, of Niobe, paint a picture of a world governed by immense and often unpredictable power. They form a quiet constellation of truths about the gods themselves. As you drift now, in this quiet space between wakefulness and sleep, let us consider for a moment the nature of these gods. The gods of the ancient Greeks were not like the benevolent, all-knowing figures of other faiths. They were not seen as morally perfect beings, to be loved and adored for their goodness. Instead, they were revered for their power, a power that was as beautiful and as terrifying as nature itself. The gods were anthropomorphic. This simply means that they had human forms, and more importantly, human emotions. They felt jealousy, they felt desire, they felt pride, and they felt a rage that could shake the very foundations of the world. Their emotions were not small things. They were epic forces, as grand and as powerful as the beings who felt them. The anger of Zeus was the distant rumble of thunder on a summer evening. The fury of Poseidon was the deep, powerful, endless rhythm of the ocean tide during a storm. The gentle smile of Apollo was the feeling of the warm sun on your face. The relationship between mortals and these gods was not one of love, but one of respect and appeasement. It was a transactional relationship designed to maintain balance and order in the universe. An offering was made, a prayer was said, not to earn the gods' affection, but to avoid their wrath, and to show that you understood your place in the cosmos. It was understood that the fundamental difference between a mortal and a god was not morality, but simply power and immortality. The gods were eternal, and their power was absolute. These myths, these stories of transformation and punishment, served a vital purpose. They helped to explain the unexplainable. In a world without modern science, myths provided reasons for the sudden and often tragic events of life. A sudden storm that sinks a ship, a sudden illness that takes a child, a sudden earthquake that levels a city, all could be understood as the actions of a displeased god. The stories gave a narrative, a cause and effect, to a world that could often seem random and cruel. They also provided a shared cultural language, a set of stories that bound the scattered city-states of the Greek world together. There was no single sacred book, no unchanging text. The myths were a fluid and living tradition, a great river of stories with many variations, told and retold by poets and playwrights for generations. They are, in the end, a profound reflection of the world as the ancient Greeks saw it. A world that is filled with incredible beauty, but also with undeniable terror. A world that is governed by forces far beyond our control. Forces that can sometimes seem utterly indifferent to our small human lives. And as you feel your own breath, its gentle, steady rhythm, you can feel the quiet truth that connects us to that ancient world. The truth of being a small part of something vast and mysterious. The profound silence of the night sky, filled with its countless stars, is the same sky they looked upon. The gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing as you relax completely is the same rhythm of life that they knew. The stories are told. The echoes have faded. All that is left now is rest. And here, our journey ends. The stories of the ancient world have been told, and now the quiet of the night deepens around you. Thank you for joining me, the sleeping scribe, on this exploration of Medusa's lost life. I hope it has brought you peace and comfort. If you've enjoyed our time together, a like or a subscription is always deeply appreciated. But for now, let all thoughts of the waking world drift away. There is nothing left to do but breathe and rest and sleep. May your dreams be gentle and your rest be deep and restorative. Sleep well.